The wind had been screaming for 6 days without pause, but Wren Calloway had stopped hearing it as noise somewhere around the second night. Now it registered only as pressure, a force working against the limestone above her head, searching for edges to grab, probing for weakness, the way a creditor probes for soft spots in an argument. It found none. The stone absorbed the violence of it the way deep water absorbs a thrown rock, taking the force and returning stillness. She stood at the mouth of the entrance chamber with her hand resting on the iron latch of the oak door, listening to what lay beyond it. 27 people were sleeping behind her in the amber reach of 2 oil lamps turned low. She knew each of them by name. She knew which pew Edmund Price occupied at the Harlan's Crossing Methodist Church on Sunday mornings, knew that Silas Dodd took his coffee with 3 measures of sugar, knew precisely what each of them had called this hollow in the months before the storm arrived. Price was curled on his side near the east wall with a wool blanket pulled to his chin, his boots still showing the packed snow lines from the journey up the ridge. Dodd had found a space against the limestone near the food stores and had not moved from it in 2 days. She checked the rope anchor, the iron spike she had driven into the rock face in October, the knot she had tied with the specific half-hitch that held under sustained load without cinching itself tighter than fingers could undo. Still fast, still running down the slope along the fence line, into the white that had swallowed Cold River Ridge whole. She stood with her palm on the spike and let the cold of the metal move through her glove, and thought about a Thursday morning in July of the previous year when none of this had happened yet. The land office in Harlan's Crossing smelled of ink-old paper and the particular mustiness of documents that had been important once and were now simply waiting to be superseded by newer ones. Silas Dodd sat behind a desk that was slightly too large for the room, which gave him the appearance of a man who had ordered furniture based on the office he intended to have rather than the one he currently occupied. He was 58 years old, wore a gold-rimmed pince-nez he touched frequently without adjusting, and possessed the expression of a man who derived quiet satisfaction from being the final signature between other people's ambitions and their legal actualization. The survey map spread across the desk between them showed the available parcels around Harlan's Crossing, Wyoming territory. A settlement of 340 souls pressed against the immensity of the high plains like a thumbtack in an open field. Most of the good ground was already spoken for. What remained carried the particular quality of land that other people had assessed and found wanting, the kind of parcels whose deficiencies were considered so obvious they required no explanation in the ledger notations beside them. Wren Calloway had ridden into Harlan's Crossing 11 days earlier on a bay mare named Juniper, with 2 field notebooks in her saddlebag, a canvas survey kit behind the cantle, and enough money in the Wells Fargo draft she carried to purchase somewhere between 30 and 90 acres, depending on what the ground was worth and who needed to sell it. She was 38 years old, 5 feet 4 inches in her survey boots, with forearms that showed the particular development that came from years of driving stakes and hauling equipment through terrain that did not accommodate wheeled vehicles. Her eyes were the gray-blue of overcast sky above tree line, the kind of eyes that registered topography the way other people registered faces instinctively, with immediate retention of significant features. She wore her dark brown hair pinned back in a way that suggested she had done it in under 90 seconds without consulting a mirror, which was accurate. She had spent 6 years as a field surveyor for the Northern Pacific Railroad, working alongside her husband Daniel through terrain that broke less prepared men, reading contour lines in the earth through the soles of her boots, before she ever set a notation in her field book, feeling the logic of a landscape through accumulated attention rather than formal instruction. She understood what made ground useful. She understood what made it dangerous. She had learned through enough seasons of field work to constitute a genuine education that these 2 qualities were frequently the same quality viewed from different distances. Her finger moved across the map without hesitation. It stopped on a limestone ridge 3 kilometers north of the town line. The notation beside it read, "Unsuitable for cultivation, rocky substrate geological feature of no agricultural value." There was a small symbol the surveying party had used to indicate a natural cavity in the southern face of the bluff, the kind of notation made when something existed that didn't fit any useful category, acknowledged only so it could be dismissed. Dodd looked up from the map. He looked at Wren's face. He looked back at the map. His hand moved to his pince-nez. Wren's voice was level. That parcel, 70 acres including the ridge. Dodd removed the pince-nez and set it on the desk with the deliberate care of a man preparing to deliver information he considered significant. Mrs. Calloway, you understand what you're looking at. The rock runs within 8 inches of the surface across most of that acreage. You couldn't put a plow blade into it without breaking the plow. There's grazing potential on the lower slope, poor quality, and as I understand it, a rather substantial hole in the side of the bluff. That hole is precisely what I want. He studied her face for evidence of jest. Finding none, he studied it for evidence of grief-induced impairment, which was the second explanation most readily available to him for a widow making an unusual decision. Whatever he found, it apparently did not rise to the level of legally actionable. He picked up his pen. The seal came down on the wax with a sound like a small door closing. $65 for the 70 acres. It is the most peculiar acquisition I've processed in 31 years of public service, Mrs. Calloway, but they are your acres to do with as you see fit. What Dodd did not know, what Wren had not told him, because it was not information she owed him, was that she had walked every foot of Cold River Ridge twice before entering his office. Once in the autumn of 1878, when the Northern Pacific Survey crew she was working with had crossed the ridge's southern base on a preliminary route assessment. Once again in March of 1880 during a drainage survey for a proposed spur line that was ultimately never built. She had stood inside the hollow both times with her field notebook open and her compass out, recording what she saw, the southern orientation that would pull low winter sun directly into the opening, during the months when warmth cost the most. The limestone structure so dry she could press her palm to the deepest wall and feel no moisture, transfer the natural arch of the cave ceiling that distributed overhead load the way a well-designed vault distributes it in cathedral construction. She had written in her 1880 field notes, in the shorthand she used for observations, she intended to return to Cold River cavity thermal mass significant, frost line shallow in limestone, viable structure possible if entry engineered correctly. She had underlined those last 4 words with the precise force of a woman writing a note to her future self. She gathered the documents, folded them into the canvas bag she carried, and walked out into the July heat of Harlan's Crossing's single-paved street. She had taken perhaps 20 steps when she heard her name. Constance Morrow was standing in the shade of the covered porch outside her husband's general store, which occupied the largest corner on Main Street and functioned as the town's primary clearinghouse for goods credit and social information, the last being the most carefully managed inventory. She was 52 years old, with silver hair arranged in a style that communicated both effort and effortlessness, and she wore clothes that were expensive by Harlan's Crossing standards, without being ostentatious by any standard that mattered to her. She did not shout. She said Wren's name in a tone that made stopping feel less like a choice than a natural conclusion. Wren stopped. Constance came down the 2 steps from the porch with the measured pace of a woman who had never moved in any direction without knowing exactly where she intended to arrive. "I heard you were in with Silas this morning." She smiled, a particular kind of smile that lived at the corners of the mouth without ever quite reaching the center. "About the land on the ridge." "That's right. I only want to say," the words carried the cadence of something rehearsed into apparent spontaneity, "that Harlan's Crossing is still a young community. People notice the choices their neighbors make, and a widow living alone on a rock 3 kilometers from the nearest house attracts a certain kind of attention. Not all of it charitable." Wren waited. "My husband knows the Aldridge brothers out of Ohio. They have 2 parcels near South Creek that would suit a single woman very well, good soil close to town, sensible price. I'm certain we could arrange an introduction." It was a remarkably complete piece of social architecture for something constructed in 40 seconds of conversation. It contained a warning, an alternative, an implication that the alternative was being offered as kindness, and not one element that could be pointed to afterward as hostile. Wren recognized the structure, the way she recognized a survey error, not through emotion, but through the precise identification of what was present and what was conspicuously absent. "I appreciate the thought," Wren said, "but I've already signed the papers." Constance held the smile in place for a moment. Then she nodded once slowly in the manner of a person filing information away under a category she had not yet named. "Of course. Well, I hope it goes the way you're planning." She turned and went back up the porch steps, and Wren continued down the street and neither woman said anything further. Something had passed between them, though something without a name. The way a shift in barometric pressure has no name, but can be felt in the joints before the weather changes. Wren felt it in the joints. That evening, she spread her field map across the bed in the single room she was renting above the grain merchant's office. She had been making additions to this map for nearly 3 years since Daniel died. Every notation was a piece of reasoning worked through in rooms like this one, in the hours after dark, when thinking was all there was to do. She traced the ridgeline with her finger and thought through what she knew in the ordered way she had learned to think about terrain, not beginning with what she wanted, but with what the ground was telling her. The hollow faced south. In winter, the low-angle December sun would send light into the opening during precisely the hours when warmth mattered most. In summer, the sun's higher arc would pass over the ridge lip without penetrating deeply, keeping the interior naturally cooler than any wood frame structure exposed on the open plain. The limestone was dry. She had verified this herself twice, with her hands on the deepest walls, which meant she could raise a floor on stone pillars and break the path of moisture completely. Timber set above dry stone did not rot from below. The cave maintained a temperature of roughly 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, a product of the Earth's thermal mass at that depth. A reservoir of stability that no conventionally constructed house sitting exposed on the Wyoming plain could replicate regardless of how many layers of lumber and batting were stacked between its occupants and the sky. She knew these things not from books, though she had read the books. She knew them from 6 winters of survey work in terrain that punished error without sentiment or delay. She reached into the canvas bag and removed a small, folded square of paper. She had been carrying it for nearly 3 years. She set it on the map in the center of the ridge she had just signed her name to, and she looked at it without opening it. She already knew what was written on it. She had written it herself on the morning after, when her hands had finally stopped shaking enough to hold a pen. Daniel James Calloway. February 14th, 1881. He had gone out to bring in firewood. It had been an ordinary errand on what had seemed like an ordinary winter evening, the kind a man made a dozen times without incident, through any given Dakota winter. The door had swung shut behind him in a gust of wind. The latch had dropped. The snow had packed against the base of the door on the outside, with a speed that only someone who had watched a plains blizzard work could believe. Because the door opened outward, as doors in that territory were built to open, as they had always been built. Because that was the way doors were built. And no one had asked why for long enough that the question itself had become unaskable. She had heard him strike the door with his fist. She had thrown herself against it from the inside, working the latch, but the drift had wedged the bottom third of the door so completely into the frame that no force she could generate moved it. She had screamed for him to go to the barn. She did not know until morning whether he had heard her. The door had killed Daniel Calloway. Not the storm, not the cold. A door built the ordinary way set into a house built. The ordinary way on open ground with no buffer between the frame and the full force of the wind, a single design decision that no one had thought to question because it had never needed questioning on any of the previous evenings. Wren folded the paper back along its creases. She placed it in the bottom of the canvas bag. She smoothed the map, folded it, set it on the table beside the lamp. She turned the lamp down. In the dark, she lay still and breathed, and for the first time in a long time she was asleep before midnight. She did not know, lying there in that rented room, that the first organized opposition had already begun. Within 48 hours of her visit to Dodd's office, 3 men who operated freight wagons in and around Harlan's Crossing had received what each of them would later describe, when they described it at all, as a social call. None of them mentioned it to Wren directly. What she discovered when she went to arrange transport for her first load of timber was that the price quoted by the first hauler was 45% above the rate she had been told to expect. The second said he was booked through October without meeting her eyes. The third, George Fennick, 61 years old, who ran 2 wagons out of the livery and lived alone in a wood frame house on the north end of Main Street, listened to her describe the job, then said without quite meeting her eyes that he made a policy of not hauling to ground he couldn't certify as stable. Wren stood in the street outside the livery in the July heat and considered this information with the same methodical attention she brought to survey discrepancies. She had enough in savings to afford the inflated rate if she eliminated every other discretionary purchase for the next 6 months. She could not afford it simultaneously with materials. The arithmetic was clear, and it was not in her favor, which meant the situation required a different variable, not a more favorable attitude toward the existing ones. She was still working through this when a shadow fell across the ground in front of her, and she looked up. Joseph Red Cloud was leaning against the livery post with his arms crossed and a tin cup in his right hand, regarding her with the unhurried attention of a man who has already formed a preliminary assessment and is waiting to see whether events will confirm or complicate it. He was 54 years old, tall through the shoulders, with the particular physical economy of a craftsman who had spent decades moving through workspaces where efficiency was not optional. His father had been a Scottish fur trader who had come through Wyoming territory in the 1820s. His mother was Lakota. He had grown up in the territory, learned his trade from a German cabinet maker in Cheyenne in his 20s, and built a reputation for joinery so precise that men who would not share a table with him at the Main Street dining room had been known to seek him out when a joint needed to meet a standard that other hands couldn't achieve. He lived in a house at the eastern edge of Harlan's Crossing, just past the point where the town's social gravity began to attenuate, and he was accorded the specific courtesy that frontier communities extended to people whose skills they needed and whose presence they nonetheless considered conditional. His voice when he spoke was unhurried. "I heard you're going to build up on Cold River Ridge." "That's right. Where are you planning the main bearing wall?" She told him. He turned the cup in his hand, studying the ground, then looked up. His assessment was direct: run the ridge beam parallel to the cave axis, and the natural arch overhead could be used for load distribution. The crown post wouldn't need to be as heavy as she had likely planned. It was the right observation. It was the observation of someone who had already thought through the structural problem in the time between hearing about her project and walking over to where she was standing. She looked at him steadily. "That's correct." Joseph Red Cloud said he had an adze and 2 chisels and nothing particular happening until October. He paused. "I'm not doing this because I think your idea is sound. I'm doing it because I dislike the way this town decides what constitutes a reasonable idea." He waited. "Those are my reasons. You can take them or not." Wren considered him for the length of time required to make an honest assessment rather than a hasty one. "Those are good enough reasons for me." Construction began in the first week of August, and it was harder than she had planned for in 2 respects, and easier than the town assumed it would be in every other. The harder parts were physical and logistical, getting materials up a limestone ridge without a proper road working with stone that required different tools and different instincts than the timber framework that constituted the sum of most Wyoming construction knowledge. The easier part was the work itself, once the approach problems were solved, because the hollow cooperated with the design in ways that Wren had calculated but not entirely felt the truth of, until she was standing inside it with framing rising around her. They transported pine logs from a stand of timber 8 kilometers east of town, cutting and seasoning as they went to manage the weight on the slope. Joseph brought a come-along and a block and tackle system he had modified with an additional sheave, which multiplied their mechanical advantage enough to make the steeper sections manageable for 2 people working alone. Wren had worked with come-alongs in mountain survey conditions. She ran her end of the system without instruction. The frame went up inside the hollow southern mouth, using the limestone arch overhead as a structural partner rather than an obstacle. Exactly what Joseph had identified at the livery, built out now into posts and crossbeams that transferred load to the arch, the way a cathedral transfers load to its vault. The floor rose on stone pillars cut from the bluff itself, elevating the living surface 12 inches above the cave floor and severing the path of moisture completely. Walls of doubled planking went up with a cavity between the layers that Wren filled with raw wool purchased at fair price from a rancher south of Cold River, packing it tight enough that a hand pressed against the outer surface. In midday August sun felt the temperature drop immediately. The door took 2 full days. It was a slab of white oak 6 centimeters thick, heavy enough that Wren needed both hands and a deliberate set of her weight to swing it fully open. Joseph forged the hinges himself in a half day at the Harlan's Crossing. Blacksmith's forge, not the standard butt hinge with its outward swing, but a modified pivot hinge that allowed the door to open inward into the structure away from any external accumulation. He set the hinge pins in mortised stone rather than wood frame, so they could not be pulled or worked loose by sustained force from outside. When the door was hung and Wren tested it for the first time, pulling it fully open and letting it swing back the latch seated with a sound like a hand closing. She stood with her palm flat on the interior surface for a moment before moving on. The stovepipe demanded the most careful thought of any single element. She ran it through a natural fissure in the limestone above the living space lining the channel with fitted stone, cut to close tolerances, sealing every joint with a clay and ash compound she had used in tunnel survey work with the railroad, the same material that had proven stable through freeze-thaw cycling in mountain conditions. If the installation failed, the problem would not be inconvenience. It would be smoke accumulation in a sealed stone space, which meant incapacitation before flame, and no egress route that wasn't already compromised by the same smoke. She tested it with green wood for 3 consecutive days before she trusted it with dry, watching the draw from the exterior exit point on the ridge above, timing the smoke clearance, adjusting the fissure lining at 2 points where the draw was uneven. Joseph watched the third test from the entrance without speaking. When the smoke cleared cleanly in under 4 minutes on a moderately windy afternoon, he nodded once. It was the specific nod of a craftsman confirming that a thing works as it should, which is a different gesture entirely from approval. On a Wednesday afternoon in late September, with the autumn light going gold across the bluff grass, Joseph drove the final peg into the crown posts with 3 strikes of his mallet. Wren stood in the center of the finished room and listened. The wind was present. She could hear it working across the ridge above, pressing, searching, moving along the stone the way water moves along a channel. But inside the hollow, it registered as a background note, a presence acknowledged and set aside, the way a river acknowledges the shape of its bank without being stopped by it. The temperature in the room was 56 degrees by her thermometer. The temperature at the entrance 10 feet away and exposed to the September wind was 41. She was still standing in the center of the room when Joseph called her name. He was near the back of the hollow where the cave narrowed and the lamplight grew thin. She brought the lamp. The marks were at shoulder height on the limestone, not erosion, not accidental, made deliberately with a sharp tool sometime in a past she could not fix precisely. A bison rendered in 24 careful lines. A circle above it. Smaller notations along the base that she could not interpret with certainty. Joseph stood beside her without speaking for a long time. Then Lakota, winter shelter. His voice was quiet, carrying no decoration. Wren looked at the marks. She looked at him. How long ago? He shook his head slightly. Long time. She stood there with the lamp held up, looking at the bison on the limestone. Something moved through her that she had not anticipated. Not pride in what she had built, but something more like recognition. She had not invented a principle. She had not discovered an insight. She had remembered something the way a person remembers something known in childhood and set aside for years until the moment arrives when the forgetting becomes impossible. The people who had sheltered here before her had understood what she understood, and they had been pushed away from the understanding, and the understanding had waited in the rock until someone came back to it. The thought did not diminish what she had built. It made the weight of building it feel shared in a way she had not expected to feel. Edmund Price arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 days after the crown post was set, 50 years old broad, through the shoulders, from 3 decades of manual work with calloused hands and a reputation built on 43 timber frame structures across Wyoming territory. He came with 3 other men, not in the spirit of curiosity, not exactly in the spirit of hostility, but in the particular spirit of a man who considers himself an authority and has received intelligence that something is happening within his domain without his awareness or sanction. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had built one kind of structure so many times so correctly by the measures he had been taught that the structure had become in his mind synonymous with the concept of shelter itself. He walked through the hollow examining the construction with the methodical attention of genuine expertise, pressing his hand against the wall sections, crouching to inspect the floor pillar bases, looking at the stovepipe installation from 3 angles. He was quiet for several minutes. Then he straightened and looked at the fissure channel above the stove. That flue installation is a hazard. Running a pipe through native rock without a proper masonry collar is an invitation to a chimney fire you cannot access. In an enclosed stone space, you'd have smoke accumulation before flame and no clear egress that isn't already compromised. Wren's voice was even. It's lined with fitted stone and sealed with a clay ash compound I've used in tunnel conditions. I tested draw and smoke clearance over 3 days before the walls were finished. Price looked at the work again. He looked at Wren. He glanced toward Joseph, who was standing near the entrance with his arms folded, observing. Then Price looked back at the stovepipe. A structure needs a foundation in ground soil. Load transfer through native rock is unpredictable under freeze-thaw cycling. The frost line in this limestone formation is less than 16 inches. The pillar bases are cut below that. The thermal mass of the bluff itself moderates foundation temperature in a way that exposed ground cannot. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said what he had come to say, the thing underneath the technical objections. "You're overcomplicating a simple problem, Mrs. Calloway. A square house on flat ground, that's what works in this territory. That's what has always worked here." He left with the three men, and Wren went back to the corner shelving she had been working on before they arrived. But 3 days later, Dodd sent word asking her to come to the land office. On the desk between them was a document bearing Price's signature. It noted that the construction at Cold River Ridge Hollow was non-standard in its foundation method, non-standard in its flue installation, non-standard in its structural integration with natural geological features, and concluded that the structure could not be certified under Harlan's Crossing building standards, that any occupant resided there without the legal protections the town extended to properly certified structures. Wren picked up the document and read it through to the final line. She observed that Price's signature showed specific elongations in certain letter forms, the particular quality of handwriting produced by a hand not fully committing to the pressure it was applying. She had seen the same quality in survey documents when a crew member recorded a measurement he wasn't certain of but had decided to let stand. She set the document down. She reached into her canvas bag and removed the folded paper she had been carrying for nearly 3 years. She placed it on Dodd's desk beside the certification notice. She did not open it or explain it. "I'll take a copy of this to keep with my title documents." Dodd made the copy. Wren thanked him, gathered both papers, and walked back up the ridge. That evening, she placed Price's certification notice under a flat stone near the entrance in the gap between the door frame and the limestone wall. Beside it, she placed the paper with Daniel's name and the date. The two documents lay against each other in the dark, one explaining why the hollow existed according to town procedure, the other explaining why it existed in fact. Joseph found her still sitting near the entrance an hour after dark. He sat down without invitation. They watched the stars come out over the plain below the lights of Harlan's Crossing, small and steady and certain in the distance. After a long while, he said, "That document changes anything for you?" "No." He nodded. "Good." The wind moved through the bluff grass with the sound of something breathing, patient and without agenda. Below the lights of Harlan's Crossing held their positions against the dark, each one representing a family that believed with the confidence of people who had never been tested by the worst version of the season that they were safe inside what they had built. They had not yet understood that what they were actually waiting for, all of them, though they did not know they were waiting, was a storm that would ask a question that only one structure in Harlan's Crossing had been built to answer. Wren understood that. She had been understanding it for nearly 3 years, since the morning she found Daniel 3 steps from the door in the snow. She was ready. October came to Cold River Ridge the way it always came to High Wyoming, not as a single event, but as a series of small surrenders, the grass going from gold to brown, the mornings requiring a second layer before the work began, the light arriving later each day with less conviction than the day before. Wren marked the season's progress in her field notebook, the same way she marked everything with numbers rather than impressions, because numbers didn't shift depending on how she felt when she wrote them. October 3rd, first hard frost ice on the stock tank, measuring 3/8 of an inch by 6 in the morning. October 11th, first morning the entrance thermometer read below 28 degrees before sunrise. October 19th, juniper began pressing against the stall boards in the evening hours, the particular restlessness of an animal whose instincts were tracking a change in atmospheric conditions that her handler had not yet confirmed through instruments. On a dry afternoon in the second week of October, Wren drove an iron spike into the limestone face beside the entrance door, a spike she had purchased at the Harlan's Crossing hardware store, along with 50 feet of 3/4-inch hemp rope, 2 additional lamp wicks, 4 pounds of rendered tallow, 6 pounds of dried salt beef, and a quantity of candles that the hardware store owner had noted without comment. She knotted the rope to the spike with a half-hitch she had used in survey conditions since her second year with the Northern Pacific, a knot that held under sustained load without cinching itself tighter than cold fingers could undo. She ran the rope down the slope parallel to the split-rail fence she had built in September, along the safest line of descent, secured it at 4 intermediate points to fence posts, with enough slack between each to follow naturally in a person's grip, and tied off the lower end to the fence corner nearest the road. Joseph watched from the entrance without moving toward her. When she came back up the slope, he was looking at the rope with the particular expression of a man who has understood something he wasn't told. He didn't ask why. She didn't explain. The rope was either necessary or it wasn't, and explaining it in advance would have sounded like prophecy, which was a form of arrogance she had no patience for in herself. She went inside and started the afternoon fire. Mabel Hart came up the ridge on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of December, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone unaccustomed to the terrain, but committed enough to the journey that turning back had stopped being an option somewhere below the midpoint of the slope. Wren saw her coming from the entrance, a slight figure in a brown wool coat staying close to the fence line without quite touching it, navigating by sight rather than by touch. Wren continued splitting kindling. She set the hatchet down when Mabel reached the entrance and stopped the way people stopped when they encountered an interior that was not what they had been told to expect. Mabel Hart was 31 years old, the wife of a wheat farmer named Caleb Hart, who worked a quarter section south of Cold River. Mother of a boy named Tommy, who was 4 years old and had spent most of the previous February coughing with the wet, grinding persistence of a child whose lungs had been compromised by 4 consecutive days in a house that couldn't hold heat above freezing during a sustained cold stretch. Mabel walked to the south wall and pressed her palm flat against the stone. She held it there for a long moment, her eyes moving from the wall to the small stove, from the stove to the ceiling of the hollow above, from the ceiling back to Wren. Her face was doing the arithmetic that Wren recognized, the arithmetic of a woman who had been carrying a specific fear alone for 10 months and was now encountering the possibility that the fear had a structural answer. She held her palm on the stone for what might have been 40 seconds. Then she looked at Wren directly. "If a storm comes, a bad one, can I bring Tommy up here?" Wren's voice carried no hesitation. "Come straight to the door. Don't stop on the slope." Mabel nodded once with the finality of a woman making a decision she did not intend to revisit. She looked around the interior one more time, not with curiosity, but with the focused attention of someone memorizing a route they may need to travel in the dark. Then she went back down the ridge, staying close to the fence line all the way to the road. 3 mornings later, before sunrise, Wren found a basket of eggs at the base of the slope, set carefully in a flattened patch of grass, no note attached. She looked at it for a moment in the cold early light. In 5 months of building, moving, working, being called various things by a town that considered itself her neighbor, no one had given her anything that didn't have a transaction attached to it. She carried the basket inside and started the morning fire. The second organized opposition came not from Price, who had already made his position a matter of record, but from a direction Wren had filed away as a possibility without quite believing it would be actualized. Harriet Vale was 44 years old, the only credentialed teacher within 60 kilometers of Harlan's Crossing. A woman whose authority in the community rested on the twin pillars of formal education and the certainty that came from having spent 20 years in classrooms where certainty was a professional requirement. She was not cruel. She was the specific kind of person who had confused clarity of conviction with moral virtue, which made her effective in ordinary conditions because her students benefited from her confidence, but left her without adequate instruments for situations that required something other than confidence to navigate. She did not name Wren in the lesson. She described over the course of what the children later reported as 2 full school days, a hypothetical settler who, having suffered a significant personal loss, allowed grief to distort judgment in ways the sufferer could not perceive. This hypothetical settler had retreated from the methods of civilized settlement into practices the species had spent generations moving past, a choice the teacher described as the confusion of fear with wisdom, the mistaking of isolation for safety. Progress, Harriet Vale told her students, meant moving toward the open prairie, building upward rather than downward, expanding the frontier rather than burrowing beneath it. A person who could not make this distinction was likely to transmit the confusion to anyone who listened to them. The children went home. Their parents over the following week repeated versions of the lesson at the saloon, the feed store, Sunday services at the Methodist Church. By the end of the month, Cold River Hollow had two names in common circulation in Harlan's Crossing. One was printable. Wren heard about the lesson from Mabel Hart, who came up the ridge on a Tuesday morning with snow on her coat, watching Wren's face carefully as she relayed what her husband Caleb had told her, which was what he had heard at the feed store, which was what three other men had heard from their wives, who had heard it from children who had been in the classroom. Wren was quiet for a moment after Mabel finished. Then she's teaching what she knows. The problem is, she doesn't yet know what she doesn't know. She paused. That's not a judgment. It's just an accurate description of her situation. Mabel studied her. That's a very measured response to someone who just called you a cautionary tale in front of every child in this county. Wren picked up the hatchet. I filed it. What she didn't say to anyone, was that she had placed Harriet Vale's lesson in the part of her mind where she kept information she would need at a later stage, the same cognitive location where she stored contour data and soil composition readings and wind pattern observations. A measurement wasn't less true because the instrument that took it had also done something unkind. Harriet Vale had made herself part of the record. What the record was eventually used for was a question for a different season. Something unexpected happened 10 days after the lesson became common knowledge in Harlan's Crossing. B. Dodd was 10 years old, the daughter of Silas Dodd, possessed of the particular skepticism of a child who has heard adults say contradictory things about the same subject often enough to develop a methodological interest in finding out for herself. On a Friday afternoon after the school day ended, she walked from the schoolhouse to the road north of town and followed it to the base of Cold River Ridge, then followed the fence line up the slope to the entrance of the hollow. She stood in the opening for a moment taking inventory. Then she walked in. Wren was checking the draft quality on the stovepipe with a strip of paper held near the collar, watching the movement of the paper to assess whether the draw was consistent across the cross-section. She did not look up immediately. B. Dodd's voice was straightforward. Miss Vale says you built a cave because your husband died. Wren held the paper strip steady for another 3 seconds, watching the movement. Then she lowered it. I built a structure inside a natural limestone formation using timber frame techniques adapted to the available architecture. The death of my husband informed some of the specific design decisions. B considered this with the seriousness it deserved. What decisions? For the next 40 minutes, Wren answered every question B. Dodd asked with the same level of technical specificity she would have brought to a conversation with an engineer. The physics of thermal mass, the structural logic of the natural arch overhead, why the door opened inward rather than outward, why the floor was raised on stone pillars rather than sitting directly on the cave floor. B asked good questions. Several of them were questions that adults hadn't thought to ask. When B left, she went back down the fence line with her hands in her coat pockets looking at the ground. She didn't say anything to her father about where she had been. But the following morning before school, she stood outside the house for a few minutes facing northwest, watching the direction from which the weather generally arrived over Cold River Ridge, noting the quality of the light. The second inspection came in mid-January, and it came alone. Price arrived without the 3 men he had brought in October, without the implicit audience that inspection requires when its true purpose is social rather than structural. He moved through the hollow, methodically checking the stovepipe installation at 3 points along its length, tapping the stone around the fissure channel, holding his bare hand near each sealed joint, and holding it there long enough to feel for heat leakage that would indicate a compromised seal. He spent 11 minutes on the pipe work alone, which was 4 minutes longer than a man conducting a cursory review would spend. Joseph was working on a windowsill repair near the south wall when Price entered. He did not stop working. When Price moved toward the stovepipe for the 3rd time, Joseph set down his plane and stepped into the space between Price and the entrance. He didn't raise his hands or his voice. He simply occupied the doorway with the settled weight of a man who has decided exactly where he is standing. You've come here twice. Joseph's voice held no particular temperature. Twice you haven't found what you came looking for. You're not here about safety. You're here because someone asked you to come. Price looked at him without expression. He looked at his notebook. He wrote in it for a moment, then closed it. No immediate hazard identified. Installation consistent with prior inspection findings. He walked past Joseph and out the door without another word. That evening, Joseph sat across the small table from Wren while the lamp flame moved in the draft from the entrance and said something he had not said in the 5 months they had been working together. Price doesn't believe you're wrong. He let the words settle. He's afraid of what it means if you're right. Wren turned this over with the deliberateness she brought to measurements that didn't immediately resolve. Is that supposed to make me feel better about the inspection? Joseph looked at her steadily. No, it's supposed to make you understand what kind of fight this actually is. She understood. She had understood it since Constance Morrow had come down those 2 porch steps in July with a manageable alternative already prepared. The fight was not about safety standards or foundation methods or flue installation technique. It was about the social cost of being visibly different from the consensus in a community small enough that every visible difference functioned as a kind of accusation. Wren was not merely different. She was a woman, a widow building something unprecedented in a territory that organized its understanding of shelter around a single model. Being right about the hollow was in certain respects more threatening to the community than being wrong would have been. January deepened, and with it came the specific variety of hardship that Wren had been tracking since October. Not dramatic, not the kind of development that produced visible alarm in people who paid casual attention to their circumstances, but a series of small contractions that told a story to anyone who knew how to read it. 3 families who had been purchasing eggs from her weekly quietly and without announcement stopped coming up the ridge. No explanation was offered. None was needed. She noted the reduction in her account book without comment, adjusted her provision calculations, accordingly added an extra row in the kitchen garden she was planning for spring. One evening in the last week of January, after Joseph had gone down to town, Wren sat alone at the table with the lamp turned low. It was the first time since the previous July that she had sat in the hollow without a task in front of her, without something requiring measurement or adjustment or construction. The stillness of the room was the same stillness it always maintained 55 degrees. The faint sound of juniper shifting weight in the stock chamber. The remote presence of the wind on the ridge above, reduced to a background murmur. She asked herself the question she had been not asking for 3 years, with the precision of a person who knows that the not asking is itself a form of answer. Had she built this because the engineering was correct? Or had she built it because a door opened the wrong way on a February night, and she could not unknow that, and this was what she had done with the unknowing? She reached up to the shelf where 2 field notebooks stood spine to spine, hers filled with thermal readings and load calculations and stovepipe performance data, and Daniel's, which she had kept with her own tools since the morning after. She took down his. The last entry in Daniel's hand drainage survey notation, Clark Fork Tributary, March 1880. Abbreviated symbols for soil permeability gradient measurements. A question mark beside a contour interval he hadn't yet resolved. The handwriting was his quick, angular, slightly forward-leaning the hand of a man moving efficiently through a task he expected to complete before dark. She sat with the notebook for a long time. The numbers in it didn't answer her question. They were just the work of an afternoon recorded by someone who had no reason to suspect the afternoon was any different from the hundreds that had preceded it. She closed the notebook and placed it back on the shelf spine against spine with hers. She turned out the lamp. In the dark, she was still for a while, and then she made the only decision available to her. The question didn't have an answer that would arrive before the fact. And the fact was that the work she had done was either sound or it wasn't. And feeling correct about one's reasons for doing a thing was not the same as the thing being correct. She would know what she needed to know in the spring one way or another. She went to sleep. In the morning, she checked the barometer at first light as she had done every morning since October. The reading was unremarkable. She recorded it and started the stove. February arrived with the wrong texture. Wren felt it before she could measure it, a quality of the cold that had shifted in the last 10 days of January from the ordinary biting cold of a Wyoming winter to something flatter and more absolute, as though the temperature had stopped varying between day and night and had simply settled at a fixed point below which nothing moved. Ordinary cold had rhythm. This did not. This was the cold of a system that had made a decision. She watched her barometer readings through the first week of February with the attention she brought to survey data that was beginning to tell a coherent story she hadn't expected. The numbers were not alarming individually. In aggregate, across 14 days of consistent notation, they described a pressure gradient she had seen once before in January of 1880, 48 hours before a front moved through that closed the Northern Pacific Survey camps for 11 days. On the morning of February 7th, Wren recorded 3 notations in her field book, closed it, placed it on the table, and sat with her hands flat on the wood surface. The birds had been gone from the ridge since dawn, not reduced in number, but absent the kind of complete departure that meant something was coming that they had known about before any instrument she owned could confirm it. The barometer had dropped 4 points between the previous evening's reading and the morning's. Juniper had not lain down since before 4 in the morning, not agitated but standing with the particular focused stillness of a horse whose instincts were tracking something her rider hadn't yet confirmed. Wren saddled Juniper and rode into Harlan's Crossing. She purchased supplies with the deliberate casualness of a person who did not want to transmit alarm salt beef. Lamp oil, rope, additional candles, distributing the purchases across 3 different stops to avoid the concentration that would draw questions. She arranged for a cord of split wood to be delivered to the base of the ridge that afternoon, paid in advance, said nothing about the reason to the man who took her money. She found Edmund Price at the sawmill overseeing the cutting of a roof beam for a commission she had heard him mention to a supplier the previous month. She waited at the edge of the yard until he acknowledged her, which he did after a moment, with the expression of a man who had already decided the conversation was going to cost him something. Wren's voice was level. "There's a significant storm coming, probably within 36 hours. You have houses on the north side of this town carrying roof loads on span lengths I wouldn't trust in sustained high wind." Price looked at her. Around them, the mill continued its noise. 2 of his men glanced over briefly, then returned their attention to the work with the careful disinterest of people who have decided not to be present for something. "It's February in Wyoming, Mrs. Calloway. It's cold, the sky is gray. These are not news. I've been logging daily barometric readings since October. The rate of change in the last 18 hours is not consistent with a normal cold stretch. It's consistent with a pressure drop I observed personally in January of 1880, 48 hours before a front that shut down our entire survey operation for 11 days. Something moved behind Price's expression, not quite a tension, but the beginning of it, a slight adjustment in his focus. Then it closed again. A ridge location has a way of making things seem more serious than they are. Isolated ground does that to a person's perception over time. He said it without edge, without malice, in the tone of a man stating something he considered factually established. The absence of malice was what stayed with Wren as she turned away. He was not performing disbelief. He genuinely believed what he had just said, with the confidence that came from 30 years of experience telling him his judgment was reliable. Wren turned toward the 2 mill workers who had been listening behind the pretense of not listening. "If I'm wrong, you lose nothing by checking your roof lines. If I'm right, you'll remember this conversation." She walked to where Juniper was tied, mounted, rode back toward the ridge. The rest of that afternoon moved with the controlled urgency of a drill she had run through her mind since October. Every container in the hollow filled with water. The side chamber crib stacked with additional hay above what the stock needed for a normal week. 4 days of split wood brought inside and stacked in the entrance chamber, which had been built with enough depth to serve exactly this function. Every window seal, checked every door hinge, examined every point on the stovepipe installation, tested by hand for any movement or shift since the autumn. Joseph arrived in the late afternoon without being summoned. He looked at the preparations underway, picked up the second coil of rope from the wall. Peg went to the entrance and extended the existing rope line, adding 45 additional feet knotted at the anchor point, securing the new length to run further down the slope. He did it then in the light of the late afternoon before the storm arrived, before anyone knocked at the door. He did not ask why. He had been watching the sky since noon. When the stock was settled and the provisions were counted, and there was nothing left to prepare that could be prepared. Wren went to the entrance and looked down at the lights of Harlan's Crossing in the early dark. The lights were small and certain in the valley below. Each one a family holding a model of the world that did not yet include what the next 36 hours would require of it. Before she turned in, she took Daniel's field notebook from the shelf and opened it. Not to the last page this time, to a page from the summer of 1879, a survey entry from a ridge above the Clark Fork. She read the numbers he had written, elevation readings, compass, bearings, soil notations, in his quick, angular hand. Numbers from an ordinary afternoon of work recorded by a man who had no reason to think the afternoon was different from any other. She placed the notebook back and went to sleep. She woke at 3 in the morning to silence. Not the silence of calm, the silence of held breath, the pressurized absence of sound that preceded a front moving through at speed. The wind had stopped. She was dressed before she was fully awake, her body running the preparation sequence her mind had rehearsed often enough to become autonomous. She had the stove loaded and drawing before the first tremor reached the hollow from the northwest. Not sound yet, but a change in air pressure against the eardrums. A physical notification that arrived before the acoustic one. Then the storm arrived. It was not the way fiction renders a blizzard, not a roar, not a single dramatic wave of sound. It was a sustained multi-frequency wall of noise that contained within it every pitch produced by wind, moving at speed against every surface it encountered simultaneously. The limestone took it, broke it into component frequencies, distributed the energy through the rock, returned to the interior. A background murmur that was present, but no longer at the center of experience. The temperature at the entrance dropped 7 degrees Celsius in the first 40 minutes. Wren recorded both numbers, the interior temperature and the entrance temperature, in her field notebook, because that was what she did with data. The temperature at the rear wall of the living space did not change. She sat in the chair nearest the stove, the field notebook open on her knee, listening to the hollow breathe around her. The stone walls were doing exactly what she had calculated they would do. And the calculating and the doing were two separate things. And the doing was something she was experiencing for the first time, and it was steadier than she had expected. 2 hours after the storm arrived, 3 sharp impacts struck the exterior rock face beside the entrance, rhythmic, deliberate, the knock of a human fist, rather than the random percussion of wind-driven debris. Wren was already on her feet before the third impact landed. She lifted the iron bar on the oak door. She pulled it open inward toward her. Mabel Hart stood in the entrance chamber with Tommy tied against her chest in a doubled length of cloth, his face pressed into the collar of her coat, his small body held there with the specific compression of a woman who had been carrying him through conditions that required both hands for navigation. Mabel's coat was white with driven snow packed into every fold. Her gait as she stepped across the threshold had the slightly disconnected quality of a person whose muscle coordination was beginning to fragment from sustained cold exposure. Tommy's face, when Wren unwound the cloth, pale but not the waxy white that indicated deep cold penetration. The cold had reached the surface but not the core. Wren lifted him and held him against her own chest. Not against the stove, because warming extremities before the core temperature had stabilized caused vascular disruption she had seen firsthand in field conditions. She walked slowly around the room with him, letting the ambient temperature of the space do the work at the pace it required. Mabel sat on the bench with both hands around a cup of warm water and didn't speak for several minutes. When she did, her voice was still slightly fragmented at the edges. "The road is gone. I cannot see the front of my house from the front window." Wren kept moving slowly around the room with Tommy against her shoulder. "You followed the fence line correctly." Mabel looked at her from across the table. "I've been thinking about that fence since October. I wondered why you put it there when there was nothing to fence." Wren said nothing. Tommy made a sound against her shoulder, not crying something earlier than crying a small, insistent complaint that meant the warmth was reaching him, that his body was registering the change from the outside in. Mabel closed her eyes for the first time since she had entered. Outside, the storm continued, applying its force to every surface it could reach, searching for weakness in the way all sustained forces search, not with intelligence, not with intention, but with the implacability of physics meeting architecture. Inside the hollow, the stone did what it had always done. It held. More people came through the night and into the days that followed, each arrival announced by the same 3 deliberate knocks against the exterior rock face, a pattern that spread among those who made the journey, the way useful information spreads in a crisis, person to person, without ceremony. A family from the South Road arrived on the second morning, the father carrying one child on his back, while his wife held the other against her chest. An older couple from the north end of town came at dusk of the second day, the husband's left hand showing the early modeling of frostbite that required immediate attention. Wren worked through each arrival with the same methodical sequence: assess the condition, manage the warming rate, find a place along the walls where the person could rest without blocking the path between the entrance chamber and the main room. By the end of the second day, there were 19 people inside Cold River Hollow, distributed through the main living space and the side chambers, with the pragmatic density of people who have stopped caring about proximity to strangers. Joseph had claimed the entrance chamber without discussion, sleeping there in the colder air and spending his waking hours on the maintenance tasks that kept people alive in a confined space, checking the rope anchor, monitoring the stock, keeping the stove fed, at the precise rate that maintained temperature without exhausting the wood supply faster than the reserve could sustain. He worked with the same economy of motion in crisis that he brought to finished carpentry. No action wasted, no task repeated because it had been done incorrectly the first time. On the third evening, 3 rapid knocks sounded against the rock. Wren lifted the bar. She pulled the door open. Edmund Price was on his knees in the entrance, both palms pressed flat against the limestone face, using the stone to hold himself upright, the way a man uses a wall when his legs have exhausted their reserves. His son Robert, 23 years old and broad through the shoulders, like his father, crouched beside him with one arm behind the older man's back and the other hand gripping the rope. Both of them were packed with driven snow to the shoulders, the horizontal accumulation of sustained wind-driven exposure filling every fold of clothing until the fabric had doubled in weight. Price's face had gone the color of old tallow. His lips had cracked and the blood had frozen in the creases. His hands, when Wren took hold of them to pull him across the threshold, had the stiff resistance of leather left too long in cold water. Joseph took Robert. Wren took the father. They moved them into the entrance chamber. The outer door closed. The temperature differential hit both men immediately. The warmth of the hollow relative to what they had been in was not dramatic in absolute terms, but after hours of sustained exposure, it registered on the skin, the way surfacing from cold water registers a physical shock of contrast. Price couldn't speak for several minutes. Wren worked his coat off, replaced it with a dry wool blanket, placed his hands between her own palms. She did not rub them. Friction on tissue at that temperature caused cellular disruption rather than recovery. A fact she had learned when a survey crew member had made the mistake in her presence and spent 2 days incapacitated from the damage. She held his hand steadily, letting the warmth transfer at the rate the tissue could accept. When Price's jaw had loosened enough to permit speech, the words came in fragments, the syllables slightly separated by the residual rigidity of muscles still returning to normal function. "My wife, 3 children, the door won't open." Wren looked at Joseph over Price's head. Joseph had already moved to the equipment corner and was pulling on his outer coat. Robert's voice carried the specific urgency of a young man who had just done something very difficult and was watching 2 people propose to do it again immediately. "You can't go back out there. The visibility is nothing. We nearly lost the rope line coming up." Wren was reaching for her coat. "We follow the rope down, the fence line to the road." She looked at Robert directly. "Which fence section runs closest to your house?" He told her. She fixed the detail in the specific way she fixed survey data, not by writing it down, but by placing it in the spatial map she maintained of Harlan's Crossing and its surrounding terrain. She looped the working end of the extended rope around her waist. Joseph tied his midpoint off at his sternum without being asked. They went out. The storm at close range was a different category of experience than the storm as heard through 12 inches of limestone. The sound had a physical dimension. The stone walls had been quietly erasing for 3 days. It pressed against the eardrums from multiple directions, simultaneously carrying the specific frequencies of wind, working against every edge it encountered at once. Chaotic at the surface, but mechanically consistent underneath the way a river is chaotic at the surface, while the current below runs in a single direction. The cold was absolute, but it was the sound that required active management because it interfered with the precision of thought. Wren kept her left hand on the rope. Her right hand trailed the top rail of the fence. Joseph stayed 3 steps behind her and slightly left their relative positions maintained by the rope between them rather than by sight because sight was not available. The fence appeared out of the white at the expected intervals, which meant her spatial memory of the slope was accurate, which was the only confirmation she needed to keep moving. The street when they reached it was unrecognizable. The road surface had been buried under consolidated drift in some sections and scoured to bare, frozen ground in others, the wind having made its own decisions about where materials should accumulate. Wren navigated by the landmarks she could feel rather than see: the corner post of the livery fence, the slight grade change at the feed store junction, the angled setback of the Price property from the road line. She found the front wall of the Price house by extending her hand 2 steps before she would have walked into it. She moved along the wall to the door. The drift against the base was solid, packed under sustained wind pressure into something closer to compacted ice than loose snow, 3 feet high against the lower third of the door, which opened outward, which meant the weight of the drift was working directly against any attempt to open it from inside. She had stood at a door like this before. She had been on the inside of it. She took the spade from the harness on Joseph's back without speaking. They worked in rotation, one digging one, holding the rope taut against the wall to maintain their anchor until the base of the door was clear enough to allow the outward swing. Wren put her shoulder against the frame, worked, the external latch pulled. The door opened. The interior of the Price house was dim with the specific quality of cold that accumulates over days rather than hours. Not the sharp cold of outside air, but the settled cold of a space that has given up its stored warmth incrementally until the walls and furniture have equalized with the air. Everything at the same temperature, the temperature at which the human body begins making decisions about which functions to maintain. The stove in the corner held gray ash. The wood box beside it was empty. Catherine Price was on the floor in the center of the room with all three children pressed against her, two girls and a boy, the youngest perhaps 5 years old. All of them wrapped in the combined textile resources of the entire house. Coats over blankets, over quilts. She had moved everything insulating in the house to a single point. It was the correct decision. She looked up when the door opened with an expression that moved through several states too quickly to name individually, before settling into something that was not quite relief. Because relief implies the danger has passed, and she was experienced enough to know it had not. The youngest child, the boy, was sitting slightly apart from his sisters, with a blanket wrapped twice around him, his back against the base of the kitchen table. He looked at Wren with the seriousness of a child who has been frightened for long enough that fear has become the baseline condition rather than an acute state. Wren crossed the room directly to him, crouched to his level, held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took it. They moved the family out in the configuration that the rope system permitted, Catherine holding the youngest Wren at the front, with the line Joseph at the rear, with the two older girls positioned between them. All of them connected by the rope and by the fence, and by the 40 minutes of uphill progress through conditions that made 40 minutes of uphill progress the central fact of existence. Wren set the pace slow enough to be sustainable, fast enough to prevent the family members from losing the heat generated by movement before they reached the hollow. Halfway up the slope, her left boot found a patch of ice under the consolidated snow, and she went down hard on one knee, her grip on the rope the single thing preventing her from sliding further down the grade. Joseph's weight on the line behind her stabilized it within a second. She was back on her feet in 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, with her knee against the ice and the storm pressing against every exposed surface, she did not think of Daniel's death. She thought of his voice, the specific timbre of it, when he was working through a problem in the field, low and unhurried, the voice of a man who treated difficulty as a feature of the work rather than an interruption of it. She thought of how he used to call out readings to her across a survey site, his voice carrying cleanly, even in wind, and how she had always answered before looking up from her own instrument. She had always answered. She had not left him without a response. The memory arrived not as grief, but as something more durable, the specific texture of a partnership that had been real, which no amount of subsequent loss could unmake. Then Joseph's hand found her shoulder from behind, steadying rather than pulling, and she was moving again up the slope toward the hollow's entrance, where the lamp in the window made a point of amber in the white. By the 4th day, there were 27 people inside Cold River Hollow. Silas Dodd arrived on the afternoon of the 5th day alone, following the rope line with the left side of his face, showing the early mottling that indicated he had been in the cold longer than the journey from the road should have taken. His front roof section had partially collapsed under sustained snow loading, he reported, with the flatness of a man delivering an accounting of damage he had already processed internally. He had left when the ridge beam began showing deformation. He sat near the stove, drank warm water, found a place along the south wall. He looked around the interior of the hollow for a long time with an expression of careful blankness that Wren recognized as the face of a man revising something he had held as settled knowledge without having any framework yet for what to replace it with. Harriet Vale came on the 6th day with 3 of her students, 4 figures visible on the slope below from the entrance, moving slowly. 2 of the children partly supported by the other 2, while Harriet managed the rope with one hand and held a child's arm with the other, navigating uphill through near-zero visibility with the particular determination of a woman who had decided that the thing she was doing was the thing that needed to be done, regardless of what it cost her to do it. It was, Wren thought, watching them come an act of considerable physical resolve. She went down the slope herself to meet them halfway. She took the nearest child, a girl of about 9, who immediately put her face against Wren's shoulder and held on with both arms and carried her the rest of the way up. Inside, Wren set the girl near the stove and turned to find Harriet standing in the entrance chamber. Harriet's face was flushed with cold and very still. She was holding the hands of the other 2 children, one on each side, looking at Wren with an expression that required both shame and gratitude as components, but was not reducible to either. "I owe you a statement of record," Harriet said. Wren's voice was even. "You owe me nothing. Sit down and get warm." Harriet sat. But after the children had been settled, after the feeling had returned to her hands enough to hold a tin cup without shaking, she was not finished. "I told my students that you were operating from grief, that this was fear wearing the clothes of wisdom." She waited. "I was describing myself. I was frightened by the fact that a woman working alone had thought of something I had not thought of, and I dressed that fear in the language of progress, because those are words that carry authority in a classroom." The words settled into the hollow's quiet. Around them, children breathed. The stove worked. The stone held the temperature it had always held. Wren looked at her for a long moment. "When this is over, come back. Bring something to write with. I'll show you what's here." Harriet looked at her steadily. She nodded once with the gravity of a person making a commitment they intend to keep because they understand the cost of the alternative. Marcus Webb arrived on the morning of the 7th day, and he arrived differently than the others. He was 55 years old, large through the chest, with the physical reserves of decades of outdoor labor, and he had apparently spent the previous 6 days managing the crisis at his ranch property before the situation there became untenable. He had lost his storage barn on the 2nd day, he reported without visible emotion, in the voice of a man who has completed the grieving of a loss and moved to the accounting of it. The north wall had failed under snow loading. He had recovered what animals he could and sheltered them in the main house for 4 days before the house itself could no longer be maintained at a survivable temperature. He stood in the entrance chamber and surveyed the people distributed through the hollow spaces with the evaluative attention of a man who has spent his life assessing the carrying capacity of structures and terrain. Then he looked at Wren directly. "What do you need done?" "There are 2 families on the South Road who haven't arrived here and should have by now. I need someone to go with me to check." Webb said, "Tell me the rope system." She explained it in 4 sentences. He understood it in 4 sentences and asked one clarifying question about the fence junction at the South Road turnoff. They went out together within the hour. They found the Aldridge family sheltering in their root cellar, which was cold but structurally intact. The house above them had lost its chimney stack on the 3rd day, rendering the interior uninhabitable without heat, but the root cellar's earthen walls had maintained enough thermal mass to keep the family functional if miserable. Wren and Webb brought them up the ridge in a single trip. The second family's house was standing when they reached it. The door was accessible. The interior was empty, the stove cold, 2 chairs pushed back from the kitchen table at the angles that suggested people who had left in a hurry rather than people who had left with a plan. Wren stood in the empty kitchen and looked at the cold stove for a long moment. She did not speculate. She recorded the fact of the absence in the field notebook she had carried in her coat pocket throughout the storm, and moved on because fieldwork required the discipline of recording what was present and what was absent without filling the gap between them with assumption. She learned what the empty kitchen meant 3 days after the storm ended when the search parties went out. The storm stopped on the morning of the 8th day. It stopped the way a sound stops when its source is removed, not with gradual diminishment, but with a completeness that left behind a silence so total it had its own weight, its own pressure, against the ears that had spent 8 days processing continuous noise. Wren was awake when it happened. She lay still for several minutes, receiving the quiet, the way a person receives news that has not yet fully resolved into meaning. Then she dressed, went to the entrance chamber, lifted the bar on the oak door, pushed it open. The world outside Cold River Hollow had been remade. 8 days of sustained wind had sculpted the plain below into a landscape of curved, compressed forms that bore no relationship to the flat terrain that had existed before the storm. The road was buried. The fence lines were buried. The roof lines of Harlan's Crossing were visible in the distance as a series of irregular dark shapes at varying heights. Some of them where they should be, some of them in configurations that told their story without requiring interpretation. Joseph came and stood beside her. They looked at the same view without speaking. There was nothing to say that the view didn't already contain. She organized the search parties that morning. Webb took the South Road with Robert Price and two other men who had recovered enough to be useful. Wren took the North Road with Joseph. Dodd, who had no practical skill for search work, but needed to do something with his hands and his conscience, stayed at the Hollow and managed the logistics of 27 people, a task that suited both his temperament and his limitations, and that he performed with more competence than Wren had expected. The accounting took 3 days of working outward from Harlan's Crossing through drifts that in some locations required them to probe with poles before stepping. 12 people had died. 2 were ranch hands from Webb's property who had gone out on the second day to try to reach the livestock and had not returned. The family Wren had found missing from their kitchen had made it to the stone foundation of the Methodist Church, where the pastor and his wife had sheltered 6 families through the storm, the stone holding as stone holds, indifferent to the force applied to it. 3 of the 12 deaths were older residents living alone whose fuel had run out or whose stoves had failed in the night. The remaining 7 shared a common feature across their separate circumstances: structures that had failed at the points of greatest exposure. The places where conventional construction met, sustained extraordinary force, and found the gap between them. George Fennick was among the 12. He had died in his house on the north end of Main Street on the 4th day, the stove ash cold, the wood box empty alone in a room that had equalized with the outside air over the preceding 48 hours. He had lived 3 steps from a road that a better insulated entry vestibule might have made accessible for 2 additional days. Wren recorded his name in her field notebook below the others in the same hand she used for survey data, because the precision of the notation was the only form of respect she had available to offer him. 3 weeks after the storm ended, Constance Morrow walked up the ridge alone. She came on a morning when the paths had been broken, but the snow was still deep on either side of them. The sky the flat gray of a season that had spent its violence and was now simply occupying its remaining calendar. She wore her good coat, which was an acknowledgement of the formality of the visit that nothing in her manner otherwise revealed. She stopped in the entrance of the hollow and looked at the interior for a long time before speaking. "Mr. Fennick?" Her voice was very controlled. "Could he have survived?" Wren looked at her steadily. The kindness available to her in this moment was honesty, not comfort. If his house had a properly insulated entry vestibule, he might have maintained survivable temperature for 2 more days. If he hadn't been alone, almost certainly. She waited a beat. He was alone because his financial situation had become complicated in the months before the storm. His freight business had lost several contracts. Constance held Wren's gaze without flinching, which was its own form of courage. She stood in the entrance for another moment, then turned and went back down the slope. She did not ask for absolution. Wren did not offer it. What passed between them in that brief exchange was something more durable than either the acknowledgement of a consequence that could not be undone received by the person responsible without deflection. Price came to the hollow in the last week of February alone on foot, carrying his notebook. He moved through the space from entrance to rear wall, while Wren walked him through each element in sequence: the entrance chamber dimensions and the thermal buffer logic behind them, the door pivot mechanism, and why the inward opening mattered in the specific conditions they had just experienced, the pillar system and the frost line calculation in limestone versus clay-bearing soil, the stovepipe installation points, and the draw test methodology she had used to verify each joint. She explained each element not as a demonstration of foresight, but as a practical curriculum, the way a craftsman transmits technique to another craftsman, because the knowledge was only as useful as the number of people who could apply it. Price asked questions that came from genuine engagement rather than from the search for vulnerabilities. He filled 6 pages in the notebook. At the end, standing near the entrance with the notebook open in his hands, he said, "I've built 43 structures in this territory. I built them correctly by every standard I was taught. Not one of them was built for the worst day." Wren held his words for a moment before answering, because they deserved to be held. "That's not a moral failure. It's a design parameter that can be changed." Price looked at his notebook. He looked at the door at the pivot hinge, the inward swing, the iron bar in its bracket. How many of the existing houses could be modified? Earthen berms on the north exposure, extended entry vestibules, revised chimney configurations. Most of them, some more than others. It depends on what the ground will support. He looked at her directly. "I'd like to survey them with you, if you're willing." She was willing. Harriet Vale returned on a Tuesday, as she had said she would, with the brown cloth journal she used for lesson preparation and a pen she had clearly selected with care. She asked Wren to begin not from the construction, but from the reasoning, from the moment the reasoning had begun. Wren talked for 2 hours. Harriet wrote without stopping, except to turn pages, the specific quality of her attention shifting as the account progressed from the polite attention of someone gathering information to the focused attention of someone encountering ideas that were rearranging things they had previously considered settled. At the end, Harriet closed the journal. "I'm going to teach this to my students, not as a curiosity, as applied science and applied judgment." Wren's response was immediate. "Include the mistakes. Include what the town thought. They'll learn more from the resistance than from the result." Harriet was quiet for a moment. "I was the resistance. I know. That's why I want you to be the one who teaches it." One evening in March, working late on the entry vestibule framing of a house south of Cold River, Joseph set down his plane and sat on a timber. He was quiet for long enough that Wren, checking the berm angle with a level 30 feet away, looked up. "You never asked me why I came to the livery that morning," he said. "You told me. You dislike the way this town decides what constitutes a reasonable idea." "That was true. It wasn't the whole truth." She waited. "My grandmother's family lived in earth lodge structures on the upper Missouri. 6 generations. The government moved them in 1862. He looked at the vestibule framing he had been building. "She told me about them when I was young. I understood it as history. I thought history meant finished." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't understand what you were doing until I saw the Lakota marks on your wall." Wren set the level down. She looked at him across the unfinished frame. "I thought you should know that," he said. "That the idea didn't begin with you. That it goes back further than either of us, and that people were forced away from it, and that you came back to it without knowing you were coming back to something." He picked up the plane. "What you built isn't just yours. It belongs to a longer chain than you started." She stood with that for a moment, the weight of it, the specific comfort of it. "I've known since the day you pointed out those marks. I've thought about it often." She looked at the framing between them. "It makes the building feel less like invention and more like continuation." Joseph looked at her. He nodded once with the slight deliberateness of a man confirming that the right word has been found. He went back to work. The season that followed was the season of building. 11 new structures appeared in the county before the next winter. Not caves, not hollow-based construction, but conventional timber frame houses modified according to the principles that had kept 27 people alive through the worst storm in Harlan's Crossing's recorded history. Earthen berms along the north and west exposures built up and compacted before the ground froze. Extended entry vestibules functioning as thermal and wind pressure buffers. Chimney configurations revised to maintain reliable draft in high wind conditions. Subterranean storage for food and certain categories of livestock, using the ground's own thermal equilibrium rather than fighting it. Joseph built 7 of the 11. He was called not because there was no one else available, but because he was the best available, a distinction that had existed before the storm, but had not previously been acknowledged in the form of regular work at fair wages. No ceremony marked the shift. No apology preceded it. The acknowledgement took the form that acknowledgement takes in communities built on practical necessity. The jobs came, the pay was correct, the work was taken seriously. Joseph brought to each structure the same economy of motion he had brought to every project since his apprenticeship. The knowledge of 2 building traditions operating simultaneously in every joint he cut. Mabel Hart spent the remainder of the winter and the following spring maintaining a household temperature record daily readings taken at 4 points in her house morning and evening with notes on stove fuel consumption and exterior conditions. The document she delivered to Wren in June was methodical, accurate, the work of a mind that had been observing carefully all along and had now found a framework in which the observation was useful. Wren read through every page. "This is yours," she said. "Make a copy. Keep the original." Mabel looked at her for a moment, then folded the journal back into her coat pocket, the gesture of a person who has been given something back that they had not quite realized they had offered. The plaque was installed in November of 1884 on a morning when the sky carried the particular gray of weather preparing to change. Dodd had proposed it. Price had cut the stone surround with the same precision he brought to every joint in every structure he had ever built. The work of a man who understood that this was not a small thing, and that small things were not where his skill was demonstrated. Harriet Vale had composed the text drawing on the 2 hours of notes she had taken in March and the subsequent months of developing them into the curriculum she had begun quietly sharing with other teachers across the territory Cold River Hollow. Built in defiance of convention, proven by storm. Here Wren Calloway demonstrated that the wisest shelter does not fight the land, it listens to it. Wren read the plaque once, standing in front of it on that November morning, with her breath visible in the cold air. Then she turned away from it, not in rejection, but in the way a person turns away from a mirror once they have seen what they needed to see, because the reflection is not the thing itself. She looked up at the entrance of the hollow above the plaque. The oak door was visible in the recess of the stone, closed now in the morning cold. The rope was still on its anchor, running down the slope along the fence line, because she had left it there through the summer and into the autumn, and had not found a sufficient reason to take it down. She thought about what the hollow had built, that she had not planned for what it had set in motion by being what it was when the storm arrived. Price's notebook filling with pages, Harriet's curriculum moving through classrooms she would never enter, Mabel's temperature records in her own careful hand, Joseph's work going into 7 structures that would shelter people through storms not yet named, B. Dodd growing up in a town where a woman who built something people called madness had been proven right in a way that could not be revised or minimized, a fact B would carry into whatever she built in her own life, in whatever form that building took. The idea had not stayed in the rock. That was the thing Wren had not anticipated when she had begun alone in a rented room with a field map and a folded piece of paper bearing Daniel's name. She had built a hollow. The hollow had built something that had no walls, something that moved through people and came out the other side, as different choices, different structures, different questions asked before the worst day arrived rather than after. She put her hand on the iron door latch. The metal was cold, through her glove solid, the temperature of November limestone held in shaped iron. She pulled the door open inward toward her. The movement of it was exactly what she had calculated when she designed the hinge smooth, balanced, offering no resistance at the threshold. Inside the small stove with its unhurried fire, the light moving on the limestone walls without urgency. On the shelf above the work table, 2 field notebooks stood spine to spine, hers against Daniel's the way she had placed them and left them since the first month. She stepped inside. She pulled the door closed behind her. The latch seated with the sound she had calibrated it to make a sound with nothing unnecessary in it, just a well-made thing functioning as it was built to function. Outside, the rope ran from its anchor down the slope along the fence line, visible against the November ground. She had put it there for a reason that had proven correct. The season was changing. There would be other winters. The hollow had held once, and the holding was not a finished thing. It was a demonstration, the first proof in what she intended to be a longer argument, made not in words but in standing structures, in the simple fact of people surviving days that would otherwise have killed them. She sat down at the work table. She opened her field notebook to the next blank page. She picked up her pen.